Welcome to our next episode of Football Transfer Markets. Today our guest will be Marton Kis, international sports lawyer from Sila International Lawyers. He's a litigator at CAS and FIFA level, and not only, and today he will cover for us Hungarian jurisdiction, as this is another excellent opportunity to learn domestic jurisdiction from experts directly. We sincerely hope you will like it. Enjoy. Marton, nice to have you here. Thanks for accepting the invitation.
Thank you for having me.
We find profiled people from different jurisdictions to speak about domestic markets and domestic regulations. But also we have studied a little bit and understood that main points which differ from country to country are the training compensation system, the transfer fee types commonly used during domestic transfers, and also the transfers related to exporting the players. And the third one is so-called standard contract form, usually recommended or enforced by the league or FA. These are the three topics which deviate from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And specifically, we try to avoid speaking about competition regulations because this is absolutely another realm to cover on. So we decided to take subjects which are interconnected also with international football law. So these are the three topics we are going to discuss. And the fourth question is absolutely up to you to decide what you want to cover, what you want to speak about. And Yuri Zaitsev already told us about the absence of the NDRC at the local level. So I suppose you have quite interesting situation going on at the local court, let's say jurisdiction. And also, additionally, feel free to speak about anything you want. As you also know me, I think I will be capable to pick up the conversation ongoing. So let's start. Domestic training compensation system, how it works in Hungary, and what would you like to highlight apart from the regulations?
So thank you for the introduction and having me. I think this is quite interesting because a lot of people know about the international aspect, but given in each country how it works might be different. And particularly one thing I want to highlight from the beginning, which I'm sure that you'll have similar experience with Armenia and also just Eastern Europe in general, is the huge, and I guess it's a lot of parts around the world, but it's a huge difference between domestic training compensation fees versus international. So there's a huge disparity in the type of money that's paid for training a player domestically and internationally. So I'll give you an example. Like if it's just called the training compensation strictly, and I'll go into how it's categorized in Hungary and what kind of forms there are, but 1,000 euros a year. 1,000 euros a year versus, FIFA's categories, you have 90, 60, 30, 10, 2, 4, we know the different continents as well, or sorry, confederations. But when we're talking about 1,000 versus even 10,000 at the UEFA category level, fourth category, that's a big difference. And there's this one issue that I find happening in Hungary frequently is, and I'll get into the system so you understand a bit, but what ends up happening is that the big clubs in first division will, obviously they have the bigger budget, it's natural, they'll bring in players from different parts of the world. But when the chain in training compensation is broken, when the first professional is given, and then let's say they transfer that player abroad later, then the amount of money that they invest in that player that they pay back to the clubs will be so insignificant compared to what they might claim in training compensation. So what I can give you as an example is there was a player who I worked with a couple of years ago who was moving from Budapest Honvéd, who at the time was first division, and the player spent, I think at the time already 2 or the third season at Honvéd, so at least he was there for a while. But when he moved abroad to Fiorentina, the discussion there over training compensation, we're talking about 60,000 per year, so we're close to that 100 to 80,000 amount, which was eventually reduced to, I think it was a 125. But now what Honvéd ended up paying back to the previous clubs was, I think, about 10,000 euros. So you have a 12-time multiplier, what you end up getting for that player. And of course, this is with no disrespect to the training that they put into the player and what made him be who he is. But if that player goes abroad and gets his first professional abroad versus in the country, in that case, all those previous smaller clubs will end up getting a decent amount. Instead of getting 1,000 euros, they might end up actually getting 10, pro rata for how much they trained the player. So for me, this is a hurdle I find in Hungarian football. Obviously, which now leads me to also explain how the domestic system works, because it's not so simple that you simply have a solidarity and training compensation. So obviously they have solidarity, but let me get to that. I have this chart I'd like to open up. So in Hungary, the first one that I'll mention, and I'm going to leave solidarity aside because solidarity is percentages and it's more about the transfer fees. But I'll get into that probably in a later question. But we have one which is called it's if you translate it strictly, it's like youth player training compensation, but it's really just training compensation because it's taken from FIFA. It's essentially translated. They even mention the categories of FIFA. But then in terms of international system, what they say is, and I have the 2024 June regulations in front of me, for a player from age 5 to 12, so that's important, we have ages 5 to 12, per year, it's 215,350 forints. Now, if you convert that to euros, at the highest exchange rate, 1 euro is about 400. So that's about 500 euros, a little bit more, of course, but let's round it. It's 500 euros per year. Per day, it's about €1.50. So that's very little. And then when you go from 12 to 21, it increases to, well, let's say it's about 800 euros. So not even 1,000 euros. And it's about 250 per day. So that's quite a small amount. And then when we actually go into, because we have women's football, men's futsal, and women's futsal, then there, if you go to the per day, because there they don't even calculate the year, they just do per day. For women's football, it's less than €1. I think it's about 60 cents. For men's futsal, it's 50 cents, and for women's futsal, it's like 30 cents. To recap, we have training compensation domestically, we have men's and women's, and we have football like 11-a-side, and we have futsal. And if we're talking about men's, it's divided. Men's football, it's divided into two, ages 5 to 12, and then 12 to 21. But both of them are under 1,000 euros. 5 to 12 is 500. 12 to 21 is 800. Of course, given clubs' budgets and stuff like that, it makes more sense that they keep it to the small amount. But of course, this discrepancy comes back when we consider international transfers and training compensation. However, go for it. You can ask, and then I'll go to the next point.
Yeah, so the first things that I heard, which deviate from the international regulatory framework, is that you have training compensation at domestic level for women football.
Yes, exactly.
As I understood, you have like two level of age calculation. One from 12 and the other from 12 to becoming
21.
professional, right?
So
to
21
or 21. You have U21. Okay.
Yeah. Actually, before we go there, because I know you're going to ask a question about the starting the calculation at age 5. So if you don't mind, I want to point out to the second part, because this is actually a key. It's a part of the package of transfer or training compensation, but it's not per se called that, because this one is called operational cost. And now this one is the reason why we have this other category from age 5 to 12. So in Hungary, we have the system of called, it's essentially called operational compensation, operational costs. And here as well, you have senior level, right? And then you have youth level, and you also have women's. So what Hungary's done, and to be honest, the Hungarian system in large aspects, whether or not it has flaws, is quite thorough. I think they've done a great job. I guess it might come back from Hungary's history and having been a big footballing nation. But the way this one works is they had categorized for the youth level the different clubs. So you have grassroots or amateur, you have district or regional, but let's say district centers. Above that, you have talent centers, and at the highest level, you have academies. So when a player moves from one to another, you have a matrix, right, a table, where it says, okay, let's say the player's moving to academy to a grassroots, which unlikely, but then it's zero payment. If it's moving from academy to, let's say, the talent, so the second highest category, the talent center, then you have a fee which is double from the previous one, from the third category.
So excuse me for interrupting, just to be on the same line. So if it's if the player's career, amateur career, is ascending, there is a compensation. If it's descending, there is no compensation.
No. So if it's descending, then it's descending also like in a descending kind of price level, right? It just what ends up happening is that only when you get down to the fourth lowest, right, which is grassroots or amateur, then grassroots clubs will pay each other, but grassroots will not pay to anybody else in terms of movement, because the idea is that grassroots shouldn't be paying, because grassroots in Hungary is the lowest, like you have a 5-year-old, so they're really not supposed to be paying for anyone at that level. And basically, like, I'll give you an example. If we have academy to academy, then you have this bigger one, which is I think actually here the fee between academy and academy is almost 2,000 euros per year. So interestingly, in training compensation, it's 1,000 euros, but in this level, it's already 2,000 euros. And then also, let's say that it's moving from a youth center, a talent center, which is second highest, to an academy, it's 1,000 euros paid by the academy to the talent center. But if it's from talent center to talent center, it's like 250 euros. So the point of this system, why I'm explaining it in this much detail, is because obviously training compensation came first with FIFA. And then as Hungary was developing its system and categorizing it, because of the government's involvement and the sports ministry's involvement, this system had to be created because there's certain funds that go to these centers. So the way the federation redistributes the money it gets from the sports ministry, it needed to be able to qualify these different categories and also to hold them responsible for their development. But you could not expect a grassroots club from ages 5 to 8 to be producing the same as somebody else. So for me, this system specifically, I think is very, very good, because I think it should be called training compensation. And it makes more sense than our actual one that's called training compensation, because
that's what I was going to ask you, actually, because what you were describing literally falls under the definition of training costs.
Exactly.
And I was just going to ask, like, why to call it like operational costs if you have the freedom to define it as you want, because I have never seen any kind of restricting clause from FIFA saying that no, you must define it like this, or no, absolutely the opposite. FIFA left the training compensation regulation up to the FA. So,
and to add on top of that, what's really cool, I think it's at least cool. And this will also lead up to one of the questions about when we talk about transfer fees. So this training compensation that I was talking about now, this one moves into the adult level. It goes all the way up to age 34. You have categories of 19 to 21, 22 to 23, 24 to 30, and 31 to 34. And it's based on the same matrix notion of having lower category senior teams, which is usually until so in Hungary, just for you to understand, we have top 3 divisions are run by the federation, and then you have 4 divisions, which are the amateur divisions, which are run by the regional federations, right? So the regional federations from level 4 to 2 are in one. Then you have the top one of the amateur level, and then you have the national, so third division, second and first, which are supposed to be professional. And in this case, here the numbers get bigger, because here, if 2 first division clubs, if there's a player moving from one to another, let's say from age 24 to 30, then at this point, the amounts get interesting because it's going up to closer to 4,000 euros. So in this case, if a player moves for free, because it's not a transfer, it's a free move from the previous club to the next club in first division between age 24 and 30, there's this annual fee of this 4,000 euros. So this system for me is quite interesting, but it's heavily influenced. And again, I was not there when it was created, so I believe this is my interpretation, a correct interpretation of the intent, the legislator's intent. But I believe this was done in a way to ensure that because we don't have so many transfers, and I'll get that to the next question, so many transfers which are transfer fees, this is a way to compensate a club for the training that they've done for a player. And then also because of the government's subsidy going into football, going into the federation, it was important to have some kind of system that this is redistributed among the clubs for the training that they've done. So that's
in other words, we can say that the clubs are safeguarded in any way, even if the player moves out of contract, the club has an amount safeguarded for it as a training compensation, even if the player is above 23. Then, if you pay to the player as a training compensation up to 34 or whatever, it means that your FA didn't stipulate the institute or the principle of the ending of players training process or players development process. Within the meaning of FIFA, you know what I mean, right? So if you can prove that the player, FIFA defined the age of 21 as a year when the player ends
Yeah.
his or her training period. So the logic behind which you just said doesn't have this principle. So in other words, within the logic of FA, it seems that the player constantly develops and constantly has his training. And I think it's not as good as it seems from the first glance, because in this case you don't have a strict distinguishment between the amateur player and developed professional player, not from the legal perspective, but from the sporting perspective.
Yeah.
I think I expressed myself clearly, because legally speaking, we know Article 2 of RSTP, for example,
Yeah.
we have the same wording in our national law on sports. We have this article that if the athlete is getting paid, etc., and chooses the activity as a profession, then he is professional. But in this case, I think we have this problem of distinguishment if the player ended up his training process or not. I think that Hungarian FA decided to overlook, in exchange of safeguarding club's fair compensation for the player's development entirely, not as an amateur and then professional, but entirely. Because the club signs a player from its own academy. There is no chain breaking, right? The jurisprudence is clear. Yeah. So when the club signs its own player, the chain is not broken. So the first club can later claim the compensation for the whole period. But in any way, there are countless scenarios where I'm speaking about right now. I'm speaking about different jurisdictions, not only my jurisdiction.
But,
there are countless cases when the player becomes 23 and then he moves while being out of contract, and the former club gets nothing. So I think that Hungarian Federation decided to undertake the solution of this problem over the, let's say, defining the player's development process being ended, which is maybe unusual. I don't say it's wrong, okay? Maybe it's unfamiliar, unusual, but speaking from the club's perspective, I think it's more correct approach, to be honest.
Yeah, look, the interesting notion, this was actually one point I wanted to bring up, because Hungary is even more complex, because there's a kind of system for clubs to get money from companies where they pay, and then they can, it's a tax deductible amount that's sponsoring the club, and then that's turned into infrastructure development. But one important aspect is, in Hungary we have the productivity rules. So if you go on and you type in the Hungarian Federation, in Hungarian it's called MLS, and the S is the SV, or just type in Hungarian Federation productivity, you'll end up at a page which will show you a player and points that they have generated. Now, this system was created to promote, productivity or efficiency of developing youth players. And in this system, the category which they look for is under 21. So Hungary has under 21, and this under 21 level, I would argue, is, even if it's not explicitly stated, it is in their head the end of development, because what this productivity rules say and how they operate is essentially almost similar to what you mentioned about the coefficients in Russia, that basically you have a young player, then this player will play in a certain category of a certain age. So I'll give you an example. The player plays matches for the Hungarian First Division club, right? They're 18 years old, whatever, and they're playing First Division matches. And then you'll have, okay, what's the coefficient for matches in this division at this level? And then I look at how many how many minutes he has played, and then you multiply that by the number of, well, essentially the money that they have allocated um, to whatever, to this productivity.
But are
And
these points generate? Excuse me for interruption. Are
yeah,
these points generated in any case connected with the amount of training compensation? Do they have any impact on the calculation
so
or not?
so that's the point, that in fact it has no impact on that calculation. This is a completely different point and a completely different system. But what's interesting is that it sort of complements that system, but also tells us a hint that they are generally looking for paid players age 21. But what's very unique, and why your point still stands, is because we all know, well, hopefully people who will listen know, that in FIFA you have termination of sporting just cause. The sporting just cause is that if you don't play 10% of the matches. And the jurisprudence tells us that for sporting just cause, you need to be an established player. So going back to Lamine Yamal's case, one could argue that Lamine Yamal is an established player. He's won the Euros with Spain. He's at that level. He's constantly playing. He's a starter or first team player. Doesn't matter when he does his homework, right? And in Hungary, when you have this rule, the same rule, it tells you that you can exercise this within, I believe, 15 days from the last match of the season. And there is no jurisprudence that I know of and no qualification that this actually has to be for an established player. Domestically, it could be anyone. Anyone who signed a contract, went to a club, was supposed to be playing matches, and the club just didn't give him matches. It's unlikely that they will reach this because, in any way, most clubs, what they'll do is they'll have a specific agreement with the player in their contract. And then we'll get to this again in more detail, probably at the question concerning standard contracts. But the reason why I'm mentioning this now in the training compensation system is because the way clubs can generate money for their training of the player, is threefold. You have what's strictly called training compensation, which is a flat amount calculated pro rata, how much time the player spent there. Then you have the matrix of operational compensation or operational costs, which is like the international training compensation matrix of different categories, one to another. And then you have the third one, which is, okay, you have this player, and this player produces points for you when they play in certain level. To close on this, I know the regulations, I know the legal stuff, but typically clubs need to have good accountants who are aware of the sport accounting. And I have friends who work as accountants, tax advisors at the highest level, the big four companies, whatever. But even they will tell me that this system is very specific and people need to know it. So yeah, it's as if someone comes in from abroad, like for example, if potentially one of our first division clubs is sold to a foreign buyer, this is something where you need to make sure that you have the right person in the right place, in the right position to be able to understand this and to deal with it, because it is complex. It requires a lot of work, a lot of paying attention to.
I would say that training compensation is a little bit hard at the beginning, but when you understand the principles, when you do the calculations for even for complex transfers, and you get it right, so after that it becomes very usual and easy to calculate. Just because you told me about too much peculiarities, okay? Just an advanced question, like a preventive question. Does in your country solidarity mechanism have an impact on training compensation? Are they interconnected or not?
No. It's the solidarity system is the same as what FIFA defines. You have the 5% of the transfer fee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Recently I had a podcast with Hrvoje Čabraja from Lokomotiva Zagreb, and he told me from Croatian system about solidarity mechanism system, and there was a very interesting point there, just for the sake of comparison. They have solidarity contribution within solidarity contribution.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, but look how it works. Look, it's genuinely, when I heard about it's very, very balanced and very interesting. So what happens? The new club pays the former one 5%, 95 +5 transfer system. You know this, what I'm speaking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
But here comes the magic. The former club also is obliged to deduct 1% from the transfer fee, not from the solidarity, from the
Yeah.
transfer fee, and pay it to local associations to which the clubs were affiliated to and where the player was developed.
Wow.
So
That's
it's
actually very interesting.
yes, it's very interesting, and because he told this is related to the fact that Croatia is one of the exporting countries, so it's like.
Yeah.
And if indeed, if we connect it with this fact, it's reasonable to have this
Yeah. Yeah. But that's
system.
at the end of the day, a lot of these systems, and like it's a good segue, which what you mentioned with Croatia being an exporting country, is it will come back to what the country is able to produce. And Hungary's invested a lot of money in infrastructure, which I'll be honest with you, only after visiting other stadiums in other countries within the region of that part of Europe and even elsewhere in the world, but particularly Europe to be staying relevant, I realize how lucky we are with the infrastructure we have. This is setting aside any argument from any negativity. This is more focusing on the fact of what we have, like the good quality stadiums, that we're hosting European competitions, that we're hosting UEFA Champions League finals and EuroLeague Conference League finals, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, moving on to the second question about the types of transfer fees and transfer agreements, in fact, there's not a lot of domestic transfers happening. There are transfers abroad, but also not so many paid transfers. So most of the transfers within Hungary are free transfers, right? The player's contract ends and he moves free. There are some cases where they will do a transfer fee, but not a lot of it.
When saying transfer fee, you mean fixed transfer fee, right?
Yeah, sorry. So there's no fixed transfer fee. Fixed transfer fee transfers, I mean. We have, of course, some players who move abroad and then the club sells them, not necessarily Hungarian players. And of course, Hungarian players will also sometimes buy players, but the general idea is that it's free transfers. And that's also what FIFA statistics reflect, that most transfers are free transfers and a small percentages were the paid transfers, which make up that whole billion-dollar industry.
What about sell-on fee?
Sell-on fee, yeah. So that's a good point. There are sell-on fees, and there are agreements in this training compensation system we talked about. There's a lot of waiving going around and a lot of budgeting.
Yeah, the same thing is extremely popular. I noticed that especially after the clearinghouse kicking in, an extremely popular thing to have waivers in exchange of sell-on fees. And previously, before the clearinghouse, at least at my experience, I had many transfers where the transfer fees were waived in exchange of sell-on fees. So now we have also the waivers of training compensations in exchange for sell-on fees. So from the legal perspective, I always find sell-on fees a little bit problematic because notwithstanding the exact wording which is stipulated in the contract, there are several cases of restrictions which you must avoid. And then these questions already fall under the TPI rule. TPO and TPI, not TPO, TPI rule, actually, the infamous rule. Because when you read the FIFA's manual on TPI, and there are some cases where at the first glance you think, well, there is no influence, but the disciplinary committee decided otherwise. So, and the opposite, like you think there is an influence, but in fact, disciplinary committee decided again otherwise. Yeah. So that's why the sell-on fee, if for example, if when drafting sell-on fee, this is a suggestion to sports directors. If any sports director encounters this podcast, do not try to negotiate a complex sell-on fee. If you make it complex, there is a high chance that you may fall under TPI rule. Try to keep as simple as possible and protect it also by buyout, release, etc., and other conditional provisions, but not an influence. So I think sooner or later also FIFA will regulate somehow sell-on fees because if you check the statistics, and in the recent report at least there was no any wording about sell-on fee. Am I right or not?
No. Yeah, you're right. But that's this is a very good point you made, that sell-on fees in return for waivers. Because I actually had a call from a colleague from another law firm call me today and said, "Listen, I got this message," and then he says his club, the player was a free agent, went to the other club and said, "Look, you have this training compensation due. We would like to offer you sell-on," and they agreed. And the new club put in the TMS instruction that it's a free agent, no training compensation, no transfer fee due, the regular TMS instruction for that. And the other club came, apparently, because FIFA didn't see anything wrong. And then the other club came when the ITC request point and says, no, we have a sell-on fee. It's against the fee. So that club didn't understand that this is not transfer. The sell-on fee is offered for training compensation that they don't want to pay now. So you waive the training compensation, but if we sell the player, we'll pay you a sell-on fee. And it created a mess in TMS because then FIFA said, well, you have to put the right instructions, you should cancel this, put the new one. And we're like, hold up, guys, it's a different issue.
Well, let me immediately cover up this question because I was TMS user back in the days, way too long. Yeah, way too long. So I will tell. I don't want to say if they did it correct or not. I would say how would I do it in order to avoid any problems, and I will justify my explanation. First things first, I agree that this is not a transfer where you must stipulate like there is a fee and there is a sell-on. Why? Because there is no transfer agreement. Waiver agreement is not a transfer agreement. This is the first point. Second point, even if you choose, no, there is no transfer, there is no payment within the transfer. There is a button which says waivers, which is optional. Yeah. So the club should have uploaded this waiver into that section, but this is also important. This is not enough because as of my knowledge up to date, I hope this will change in future. But besides uploading it in this waiver section, at the later stage, the same clubs are obliged to upload the same waiver during the electronic player passport review process.
Exactly.
At the same part where FIFA at the beginning and then the completion phase calls up for the parties to upload waivers with the possibility to challenge it.
Exactly.
So I would do it this way, and I completely disagree that this transfer should have been done by canceling and restarting it and saying, no, there is this transfer has a payment and is being done against the payment. No, it's not. It's a tactical thing. It's not actually super legal thing, because if it will be at CAS level, I suppose at CAS level, it will be reviewed a little bit from the different angle. But from the judicial bodies of FIFA or from the same chambers we have or committees we have there, I suppose they will look at it from the tactical perspective. And this is my opinion. Maybe somebody can think otherwise, but
I think you're absolutely correct. And but why this is actually an important point is because a lot of times, obviously, this will happen at the international level, but at the domestic level in Hungary, when we're talking about transfers. And now, if someone from Hungary is listening, don't shoot the messenger or the interpreter. But what I see is that the system that we just talked about, this training compensation, operation cost, under the whole umbrella, is essentially what the club will have to analyze whether we're paying for this player. So a free agent.
Excuse me, right at the moment, right at the point, just to add what you just said, that was the error which caused this mess, because when choosing the former club section, you must choose either there is a transfer agreement or there is not.
Yeah.
And supposedly you must upload the transfer agreement. But if you have a waiver agreement at hand, waiver agreement is not a transfer agreement, because registration rights are not with the former club.
Absolutely.
That's the case. When the player is out of contract, his former club doesn't have the registration right. The registration rights are with the player.
Absolutely.
So that's the point where the error began. This is my opinion.
That's what I'm saying. That's absolutely correct, and this is why I'm saying that there's quite a bit of confusion on that on the club side. But these sell-on fees don't occur so much in Hungary because of exactly this training compensation system, where you'll have to analyze what you're paying for the player, and the clubs will have to do a lot of internal discussions and also talking between them to see, okay, look, I owe you this much. Do you reduce it? Do you accept it? How do you do it? But generally, it's not as bad as internationally where they say, oh, you have to waive it all. So clubs will receive some kind of money for it at the end of the day, but it's not significant that you can rely on being an exporting club or an exporting league or even country. But one interesting point, and this is my understanding from my experience of what I've seen, I think in Hungary, but probably the general region, there has been a misuse of this word and its application by agents putting this sell-on into their agreements with clubs. So more often than not, if I saw sell-on, it would not be between clubs making a transfer because transfers like that don't occur for a fixed fee. What would happen is the agent who would have the agreement with the club will say, if you sell the player, then you pay me a sell-on fee.
Well, my friend, wait. You got into the TPO part. So if we stipulate it like that, as you said, which is super common and which is great example of TPO violation for me, like there could not be a better example for TPO. But I think there is an exception from general rule, especially with the new FFAR. Look, now I give you a scenario, an example, and I want you, as a high-profile sports lawyer, and I accept you like that, I want you to give me your opinion on the fly on this scenario, and then we'll continue.
Okay.
What if the club hires the agent, or better to speak in a legal language, uses the agent's services as a club for a specific player, the registration of rights of which belong 100% to the club without any exceptions therefrom, but the club says in the contract with the agent the following. It's a representation contract between the club and the agent, okay?
Mhm.
And the club says the following. I hire you for your agency services to find a new club for my player against the fee, like to find specifically transfer for my player against the fee, even stipulates how much estimate the parties anticipate to fall, like the transfer fee to fall within, like you must find me a club that will buy the registration rights of my player between like 200K and 1 million, let's say. And the expenses for hiring you for this transaction, I will pay you by sell-on fee from that transaction.
Well, are you saying a sell-on fee or just a percentage of that transaction? I'm assuming you mean percentage of the transaction.
I'm saying about the percentage of the transaction, but naturally and substantially, this is a sell-on fee clause between the parties.
Well,
you see, you already got into this moment. That's what I was trying to search. Like, is it possible is it possible or not? You already deviated. Like, you distinguished the paths here, and I want to know your opinion. Do you see any TPO violation here or not?
Well, look, when FIFA came out with the FIFA agent regulations and put this in their matrix of service fee, and this was under the service fee cap, I immediately thought that, well, okay, so this is a TPO because under the RSTP, that's a TPO on the club side, but for the agent side and the agent regulations, it's allowed. So my first idea on that was that, okay, if the agent does this, then I would say the RSTP is the general rule, and then the agent regulations are the lex specialis. So under the specific rule, it would not be a TPO. But in the current atmosphere, given that the agent regulations, that specific section is suspended, you cannot do it because that specific part is suspended. You cannot agree on this. So for me, when FIFA did this, and I did not see that anywhere, they had to make an explanation that in this case, we will not consider it a TPO because generally for me, that's a TPO. And why is it a TPO? Because FIFA, even in the agent regulation, says under the definition of remuneration that you cannot get money from a sell-on fee. So in the definition of remuneration, FIFA still considers an agent a third party, not the player. The player can get the sell-on fee from the transfer fee. But when the club specifically hires the agent, like in your scenario, to sell the player, and then they'll pay him at the 10% from the transfer fee, then it's not. So again, FIFA pulled the typical FIFA instead of thinking it through and putting it to clarify it.
I must emphasize that when FIFA released the new commentary on RSTP, I was super happy. Like the guys did tremendous job, but you know how it happens psychologically. When you see this kind of effort, you automatically start to expect the same level at anywhere, right?
Yeah.
So now you already psychologically, as a consumer of it, because we are consumers of it, let's be honest.
Absolutely.
Like the guys work on it like countless of hours, etc., digging out the cast cases, etc., and we consume it because we read it, etc. We understand the official position, etc. But we psychologically expect the same level of explanation and commentary for the other regulations.
Absolutely.
Or within the framework of the other regulations. As you said, the interconnection between the FFAR and TPO, right? So I think the scenario which I just brought up for you, we will know only if this kind of case will be submitted to CAS specifically, not to FIFA. But I think if you draft it carefully, there is no any TPO, at least at the scenario which I told, because you hired a for this job. Like you cannot pay. Let's say, how when the FFAR was drafted, what was the logic behind it? How the club can hire an agent? How can it happen?
Yeah. I mean,
so there must be some percentage, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean that's the. I agree with you there because if you're the releasing club hiring the agent to sell the player in the early days, and I may be wrong in that, but usually they were saying you cannot have a percentage because that's a TPO. It had to be a fixed amount. So when, let's say, you hire an agent, so there was this issue that already at that time they were dealing with, realizing, yeah, but okay, if it's a fixed fee for the service, but that fixed fee will also increase if there's a higher transfer fee. And then there were cases of finding it as a TPO violation. So if they were hiring it, at least from some of the cases I read, it was okay, you hire the agent as a releasing club to sell your player, and you say, look, for this service, I'll pay you 10,000 euros. But a lot of times, what would happen, or what I saw happening, is that the club and the agent would say, okay, you're telling me to sell the player, but you're telling me, what if I bring a deal for you for 500K or for a million? I shouldn't be getting a fixed fee for that. So then what they started doing was saying, okay, if you bring it for 1 to 200, it's 10K, 2 to 400, it's 20K, and then et cetera, and going up in stages. So at the end of the day, for me, this current point makes sense. But the issue again is that FIFA says that you cannot have money from the sell-on fee. So I don't understand why an agent under the current FIFA regulations can get money from the direct transfer, but not from the sell-on. It essentially says that I'm the new club, I sell the player, I sell 100% of the player's economic rights, but I give you a sell-on fee. So it's a very, very thin line, but FIFA accepts that between clubs. So why can't the agent? Because there are instances, and I'll give you a good example, where the agent's job is a very risky business, right? So I bring a talented player to a club, and this player, the club says, I cannot pay you an agent fee, but the club's hired you, whatever. And so you say, okay, don't pay me the agent fee now, or pay me a very small amount, symbolic. But if this player is successful, because I believe that he will be successful, pay me my 10% from the next sale. You sell 100% economic rights, and then you pay me. So from my point of view, I understand the issues with TPOs, because what used to happen, especially in Brazil, is that a company would pay the player, support the career, and then would tell the club, look, no, I own 40%, you own 60%, and I'm able to decide where these are going. Similar to image rights, because a lot of agents are coming to me now with image rights saying, oh, this is the next big business.
Yeah, let's jump to the third question, which is standard contract forms recommended or enforced by the league or FA. Do you have this scenario in Hungary? If you have, how is it being regulated? And are there any fights from the clubs, from the players? How is it being regulated?
So, okay, so we do have a standard contract, and the Hungarian RSTP says that clubs are obliged to use the standard form or an equivalent. Now, this or an equivalent is a bit tough, and generally speaking, 99% of the time, this is what's used by clubs. So clubs actually receive a Word file, a Word document from the federation, not just the PDF that's in the attached to the RSTP as an annex, and they will use this. Now, the way this looks is you have a whole contract of a lot of pages, which is all standard, and then you will get to the personal conditions. And the personal conditions is where you have different parts like the salary, the duration of the contract, any other agreement between the parties, was there an agent? And that's where the parties can make it, differentiate against other players. I'll start backwards. In the personal conditions, I think that's quite nice because in the personal conditions, you can even decide to adjust a point of the contract. You can decide whether or not it applies, and you can also agree on very unique conditions. Like, for example, if the player doesn't play in 40% of the matches, then he can terminate. The bonuses, uh, basically any condition, housing, all that's important for the
Yeah,
player.
but all these conditions are of a financial nature. But what about if
Yeah.
we are speaking that the parties have agreed about specific rights and obligations? For example, the parties have agreed that the club doesn't take any liability for the medical incidents or medical injuries occurred outside of the training pitch.
Yeah, so that obviously that they can do there. So one example I can give you, which was changed now in the form, and I'll get into the contract, the quality of the contract. But the contract used to have a clause that said that if the player is moved to the second team of the club can reduce the player's salary. So what clubs would do, which is obviously abusive according to the RSTP, to FIFA RSTP, would be to decide, we were moving into the second team, we're cutting your salary by half. So actually that's what I advised all my clients, all the agents and players to write in the personal conditions that they will not apply this clause. If you don't mind, I make a small segue already into the next part about having a national dispute resolution. Yeah, so having an NDRC. Because one thing I want to mention here is that in Hungary, we don't have the notion of just cause. When it comes to what we have the termination with immediate effect. And termination with immediate effect has two key points. One, that somebody breaches their what do you call the how do I translate this? It's your essential obligations. Let's say it that way, like essential conditions, but essential obligations, purposefully or negligently, or seriously negligently. That's how it's said. The other way to have just cause
for the lawyers audience, I suppose recklessly and negligently.
Actually, one is not reckless. Yeah, I guess recklessly. Yeah, I guess that would be the right translation. Yeah, you're right. So reckless or negligently, and then you have the other which is the other option is that one of the parties, their behavior results in the impossibility to maintain the employment relationship. So that's very similar already to how just cause or good cause in Swiss law is, clarified and defined.
Ultima ratio.
Yeah, essentially it's ultima ratio and how you reach ultima ratio. But the thing is, for me, is that in terms of sports, if you would have defined and they would have taken, like you said, from the international practice and implemented and understood what is personality rights, because personality rights exist in Hungary in civil law. It exists in more civil law countries, but what they're defined as is not so much personality rights like right to employment or practice sport. It's more like right to family, privacy, those very, very, very basic core principles. So why that's taking me now into the NDRC question is because in Hungary, the federation has a chamber which is called Registration Dispute Chamber or Dispute Committee, which focuses around registration, essentially training compensation issues, clubs payments to each other, registering a player, but they cannot deal with employment because employment is strictly labor courts. We also have in Hungary a sports arbitration court created by the Hungarian Olympic Committee. They've dealt with mostly doping cases, but they've never dealt with and they cannot deal with these employments. So what little way of having how we can do that is, for example, for coaches, is coaches are not always employed, they're mandated. And when it's a mandate, not an employment contract, you can take it to this court. Now, of course, knowing civil law countries, how some things work, we have a mechanism, sort of an administrative mechanism, where to your local municipality, you can submit the contract and you can say, look, I want you to qualify this as employment. And they can do that. Or the other, of course, is you go to court and you tell the court to qualify it as employment. So I cannot change the title of a contract to mandate versus employment and say, oh, it's a mandate, it's not a employment contract. But I'm getting off track a bit. So what I was trying to make here as a point is that we have one specialized arbitration body in Hungary that cannot deal with employment. We have a national federation committee that deals with the registration, but not with the employment. So employment is left to the labor courts. And there are stories from labor courts, which I'm sure you've had in Armenia, where a judge has said, looking at the contract, looking at the parties, said, you get paid this much for running 90 minutes? Now, at that point, I think a judge should recuse themselves, because if a judge is taking a subjective tone, how much the parties agreed to pay for whatever 90 minutes of running he qualifies, is already like, okay, sorry, but that's like, you can't, it doesn't matter. They get paid whatever they get paid, right? So yeah.
What if there is a case that the players that the players' wrong registration or the lack of players valid registration caused termination of the employment contract domestically?
Well, in that case, it would still go to labor court. I've had a similar question to this.
But in this case, in order to avoid lease pendants or forum shopping or whatever, I think you must at least bring some kind of a conclusion from the committee that you just described, that there was an invalid registration, correct?
Yeah, I mean, yes. So in that sense, you could go through to both. But normally what would happen in such a case is that anyway, the federation is either brought in a party, or the federation is, you get evidence from the federation in terms of a letter or email. But I agree with you that in principle, that would be the legal strategy, that you file first there and you solve this dispute, but you try to find out what happened. And then once you get a decision from there, then you could terminate, and then you could go to the civil court. But more importantly, what I wanted to conclude is that we have the standard contract. I already talked about that, and we talked about how its consequences versus domestic or foreign players. And then now with this body, and having a competent, specialized entity, arbitration or dispute resolution chamber that can deal with these matters, would allow the case law to develop and to progress and to sort of create this uniformity. For me, the big issue there is that like you said, all of this knowledge from the international has to be brought in, because if let's say FIFA, somehow the Hungarian Federation decides we're making an NDRC because they feel they want an NDRC, they make it, FIFA accepts it, the standard contract changes to NDRC.
You hit the right place, saying that if you are going to establish an NDRC, I suppose NDRC must be constituted with not only with the compliance of the latest NDRC standard regulations, but all the history behind it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point to make, which for me would be probably an important closing remark, is just that in the NDRC regulations, there's no explicit, because also how do you qualify and how do you measure the knowledge of the members. And also that's the point I wanted to make, that if I have a foreign player who has to go to the NDRC, and I go to the NDRC and I say, listen, I have a foreign player, the FIFA regulations apply to him, and therefore Swiss law. So I don't care that your NDRC is in Hungary and that whatever, you were not applying Hungarian law. Because if at the end of the day that's what happens, then my player is screwed. So for me, I understand why FIFA created these new NDRC recognition principles. What's the purpose behind it? Reduce perhaps the workload, increase perhaps competence and practice and whatever. But for me, the most important again stands is, look, my client is an international player, and while FIFA doesn't have competence because of the jurisdictional clause explicitly referring you to this NDRC, that doesn't mean that you have to apply domestic law. Still means you have to apply international.
Correct, and that's the thing that you just covered the second remark I was going to say, that just establishing NDRC doesn't mean that you are going to apply your national law per se. It's
Exactly.
not going to work like that. Absolutely
Exactly.
not. So in any case, whether you like it or not, etc., like if you want to become a big player in the market and you want to be ready for the superstars coming and playing in your region, and we understand, right, that behind the superstars there are many lawyers, different accountants, etc. Like it's a whole team. It's not just one person coming without any preparation. So you must be ready for this kind of pressure applied onto you. So it's
Absolutely,
pretty basic.
absolutely. But look, I think the one more just to actually to wrap all of the questions up. For me, I tend to be very critical of my home country. That's probably because I see the potential of what it could achieve. I see some of the issues that could be changed, and I see some of the issues holding it back. Nonetheless, I think Hungary and Hungarian athletes, and still having seen internationally what I have seen, I still think that we're very blessed with what we have. And I still, if this podcast does get out there to some of the people in the federation, some that I've emailed with, or some clubs that I've worked with, or even agents or players, what we have to realize is that we're still, I think, in a good spot. But me, and you who work at that high level, we're expecting the highest, we're expecting the most. We know what could be achieved to get to the top. But I also know that while I might criticize FIFA in some cases or whatever, we had this discussion with I can't remember who it was actually, but it was a lawyer when we're having a talk at the CAS conference now, who said that we're spoiled with FIFA because when it comes to other international federations and other parts, and I'm not going to be naming any now because that will be bringing an emotion, but according to what I see there, it's not at that level. And in those cases, I think, damn, I wish I would be taking it to civil court because I'd have a better chance. So I still think that while, yes, Hungary has its issues, it has a complex, but with good intention and good purpose, training compensation system or mechanism, which is intended to motivate clubs to produce better players. While we're not an exporting country and we don't have that many transfers, the clubs are protected by the system, but also there's still motivation to start selling players. And then when we get to the standard contract and the NDRC, I also have to remind myself that this standard contract, if I'm not mistaken, is from 2016 or 2017. So having had it for 7 years and have it undergone change recently, I think it's still quite young and there's still a lot of room for development. The new NDRC recognition principles are also new. I know that Hungary is also trying to make some changes in its sports law and its sports arbitration body. So for me, Hungary has done a lot of has made a lot of improvements. I will be in talks with some people who have already approached me about an entity they intend to create in Hungary, which would be for this purpose. This is a non-profit organization to sort of push sports law and sports development in general. Scientific research, medical research, any kinds of research related to all kinds of sports, agency, regulation, law. All of these things would be under this entity, kind of like a think tank. And this think tank could play a significant role, and I'd like to be part of it because I think it could help develop sports and move into the right direction. And my final point is that Hungary, like many countries, I think it might be very similar in Armenia, football has the most money. And other sports, which people tend to see to be very successful at the Olympics, like our fencing teams, like water polo, swimming, handball recently, well, not recently, but continued success. A lot of them don't get the same regulations. And that's why I said we're spoiled with what we have in football. And so we can use football in Hungary to promote development in sports law for other areas of sports, where if I have an athlete who might be, let's say, a swimmer, that swimmer could benefit from the developing sports law and developing precedents and cases that are surrounded that develop, what sort of rights athletes have in general. So for me, that's the conclusion, that all of this that we have in Hungary, I think it's very unique. I think it's cool. I think compared to some countries, we were very lucky with the investments being made in sports and the developments. But I think there's a lot of room for change, and I'm hopeful that in the next decade, we will achieve just as much positive development as they have so far.
Okay, thanks for insights and your opinion, which is always justified and motivated. And thank you for accepting and coming to this small event.
Thank you.
It was really on point, and let's see how it goes, how it further develops in Hungary.
Thank you. And if there's anyone who's listening and must know that Ashot and I had a very difficult time limiting our conversation within this framework because we tend to go off topic and talk about a lot of things. So maybe there will be a part 2 or part 3 or part 4 in the future because we always have very exciting. So yeah, I appreciate the invitation and the topics.